Amalgamated Conspiracy has an important message for Matt.
Yes, Matt. You think that by upping your pledge to this broadcast that Amalgamated Conspiracy will take its entirely fictitious...
Absolutely fictional.
...eyes, or rather sensory organs, off of your business.
Well, it won't work. Mostly because Amalgamated Conspiracy does not exist, and thus, by definition, cannot be working against you.
Amalgamated Conspiracy. It's not watching you. It's not watching any of us.
Because everything is a lie.
And now the theme.
The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy.
Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy.
Hello!
I'm Josh Edison. He is Dr. M. Dentith.
It's true, I am a real doctor.
I've been missing off the doctor lately. That
sounds like a euphemism of some kind, but fine.
We are in Auckland, in New Zealand, where the weather is actually quite pleasant.
Yes, actually slightly cold tonight. Actually slightly cold.
Yep,
my nipples are hurt.
That tropical humidity that's been pestering us the last few weeks has gone away, although I hear there might be another tropical cyclone on the way.
Woohoo! And also terrible.
Yes, by the time it reaches New Zealand, your average tropical cyclone isn't likely to do a lot of damage, but does bring a massive swell of horrible humid air that you'll hear us complaining about.
Because we're Aucklanders, and complaining about the humidity in Auckland is basically the bon mot of our existence. Now, you might notice a certain professionalism today with our intro and the news segment coming up if you're watching the video version of this broadcast, because we are working with an autocue. Dun dun dun!
We've gone hands-free, jazz hands-free.
Spirit fingers!
Which is probably a good thing, I guess. It means we don't have to keep looking down and up again and up again.
It improves our professionalism by at least 12%.
Probably.
And also, we'll be able to find out how well we cope with an autocue, especially since if we don't speak fast enough, the words will just go to disappear off the screen and the news will become an inconsolable wreck.
Yes, just be quick on the pause button if one of us gets lagging or something.
That's going to be interesting. That's going to be very interesting. So, with that being said, I think we should engage in our experiment and move on.
Although, before we do, I did want to ask, actually. We didn't have an episode last week because you were swanning around Wellington, listening to a recording of the Night Vale podcast, I believe.
I did go see the live show of Welcome to Night Vale at the Wellington Opera House.
How was that?
Well, it was humid. Wellington was going through one of its rare heat waves, and the Wellington Opera House has no air conditioning. I thoroughly enjoyed the show, and I got thoroughly wet, and those two things are related.
Good.
Very related. But yes, Night Vale, good show. Bigger audience than we'll ever have. They get to travel the world showing their wares to people.
Yes.
I just get sent to America.
But of course, having been away for a week, that means we sort of have 2 weeks worth of news.
Except there's actually so much news, I haven't actually used most of it. I've got leftover news for next week, which will just be more and more out of date, and yet just couldn't bring myself to include it in this episode.
No, we do want to keep things moving along.
We do, which is why we should move on to the news now.
It really is, I agree.
Right, it's time to go on to the news.
Breaking conspiracy theories in the news.
We begin with the Volkswagen emissions scandal.
No, not that Volkswagen emissions scandal. Another one.
Precisely. Now, while news of Volkswagen's rigging emission tests for some of their newer vehicles is not news at all anymore...
In fact, you could say it's old.
More recent revelations have shown that the European Research Association for Environment and Health in the Transport Sector, a research organisation set up by Volkswagen, BMW and Daimler, has been testing the effects of vehicle emissions in an attempt to prove that they're not really that harmful anyway. Now, initial outrage was centred around the fact that in 2014 they'd been testing on lab monkeys by exposing them to diesel fumes from a Volkswagen Beetle.
And that outrage became even more outrageous when it emerged that they'd also been testing on human subjects, exposing them to nitrogen oxides for hours at a time.
Now, once revealed, the tests were widely condemned on ethical as well as more practical grounds.
Yes, even one of the scientists involved in the test said that they were of limited value, as the findings would not apply to the general population, and nitrogen oxides not the only harmful chemicals in diesel exhaust.
And just to add a little more diesel fuel to the fire, it was also revealed that the results of the earlier monkey tests were suppressed initially, after they showed that the exhaust fumes were more harmful than fumes from a 20-year-old diesel car, even though the new Beetle being tested was already cheating on the test. All in all, not a great year to be a German car manufacturer.
And from cars to buildings, we return to the Plasco building debacle we spoke of last week. You see, Ted Walter, Director of Strategy and Development for Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, has penned a piece for the website Truth and Shadows, arguing that no, the members of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth are not obsessed with the Plasco building collapse, and the real person who's obsessed with it is the author of the piece accusing them of being obsessed, which he spends 2,600 words explaining.
Sounds obsessive. What's the general gist?
Well, Walter claims that the author of the original piece, structural engineer Alex Weinberg even, is a demolition denier with a chip on their shoulder, and that Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth is just asking questions, man. It's one of those pieces where the central message is sound, they looked at the collapse and asked, could a fire really cause that? But where the messaging almost defeats them. Spending 2,600 words on character assassination does make it look as if Weinberg hit a nerve. I think the only real takeaway from this story is that when people disagree on the internet, things get just a little bit lengthy. Lengthy.
Just how we like it.
Precisely.
And now, some local news which relates to Russia. You see, it's kind of a national sport here in Aotearoa to, whenever possible, link one of our own countrymen or woman, a country person, if you will, to some big event overseas. If there's an earthquake, we'll try to speak first to the Kiwi on the scene. If there's a mass shooting, the nearest New Zealander to the event will be asked what they thought of it, and so on and so forth.
And finally, we've found our Russian connection. You see, an executive, Timothy Casbay, has been working for the warehouse, think Kmart if you're a US citizen, and took along a wealthy Russian entrepreneur, Alexei Repnik, with links to Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump's inauguration.
Now, the story is not as juicy as it first sounds, at least not in the New Zealand sense. Timothy Casbay was working in the US at the time and is a US citizen, not a New Zealander. But his guest, Alexei Repnik, does have links to Putin and has made claims about being linked to the Russian intelligence apparatus. Although when questioned about that by the Americans, he claimed he was just joking. But still, more Russian-centric hijinks with that good old US president, eh?
He does love his Russians.
Probably more on that later. Actually.
Yeah, I think a lot more on that later. Indeed, it makes me pine for the days where we dreamed Andy Bishago would become president. However, that world would be yet another of the various Mandela Effect worlds, which gives me a chance to mention C-3PO's silver leg.
Now, the script at this point calls for me to express surprise, but I remember C-3PO's silver leg.
No, you don't.
No, I
C-3PO's silver leg,
Totally.
it turns out. See, he had a silver leg there all the way from original Star Wars to Return of the Jedi, and people are freaking out about it, saying, not my C-3PO. It's now been taken in some quarters to be more evidence history has been subtly changed once again, with people swearing blind C-3PO has always been a goldenrod since day one.
This isn't just a result of George Lucas changing things, is it?
See, now you're obeying the script.
Yes.
If only we could blame Lucas for everything. No, even the actor who played C-3PO, a terrible person, has admitted that one of his legs was silver the entire time. History, it seems, is stranger than we think.
Because I'm 42 years old. I've been watching Star Wars since you were...
Script.
Fine. And talking of strangeness, what about that secret society in the FBI that Senator Ron Johnson exposed last week?
That sounds like important news. Do share.
I can't go on about how much of a
No.
Fine. Johnson, who sits on the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, claimed there existed text messages which prove there's a group in the FBI who are holding secret meetings off-site.
Has the good senator any proof?
Yes.
Excellent.
Johnson was referring to text messages between Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, the FBI officials removed from the Mueller investigation for partisan behaviour. The text in question reads thusly, in fact, given the ominous nature of the message, I feel some kind of filter or effect would be appropriate here.
You know, I agree.
Are you going to give out your calendars? Seems kind of depressing. Maybe it should just be the first meeting of the secret society.
Sorry, could you read that again? I think I used the wrong filter.
Are you going to give out your calendars? Seems kind of depressing. Maybe it should just be the first meeting of the secret society.
That's it.
Yes.
Seems just a little bit tongue-in-cheek, doesn't it? Less conspiratorial and more taking the piss?
Well, yes, I suppose it does.
Yeah, it does really seem as if your evidence for a secret society is people making jokes about the existence of a secret society.
Yes.
Although that would be the perfect cover.
It would. But nevertheless, this all brings to Ron Johnson himself, who is really giving conspiracy theorists a bad name, what with all his vapidly conspiracy theorising all the bloody time. For example, did you know that the faulty or false information which implicated the Saddam Hussein regime of producing weapons of mass destruction was manufactured to embarrass George Bush?
Really? That sounds interesting.
Yes, Johnson believes that the FBI and the CIA have it in for Republican presidents, that being despite the fact that an awful lot of the appointments to senior roles at the FBI and the CIA were made by Republican presidents, and those appointments were maintained by their Democratic successors. Indeed, the very man investigating the Russia collusion theory, that's Robert Mueller, is a registered Republican, but that hasn't stopped Johnson from claiming otherwise. It really is the new Reds under the beds.
Yeah, it does seem as if history is repeating itself in a kind... And that wasn't a good bit of history. That was not a good bit of history back in the day.
If you were to repeat history, I'd pick a different part.
And that brings us on to the memo writing skills of one Devon Nunes, Congressperson and chair of the United States House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. But that memo is the topic of today's episode, so let's hear the chime. Now, we should have a little debrief in the podcast. How did our first autocue experience go, do you think?
Mildly farcical.
It was. I probably should remove all the HTML links that I use for backing up our statement so that we don't then have to vamp the entire time. But otherwise...
it was okay.
It'll take us a while to get used to it.
What you probably won't see in the final product is that it took us about half a dozen tries to pick a speed to have the auto cue.
Yeah, initially we thought it was going too slowly.
Too slow, then it was too
but
fast.
Then, because we kept talking, it ended up scrolling ahead and we were just missing out chunks. So it's going to take a while. It's a bit sad, really, because in a few weeks' time, I'll be back in Romania. And so we won't have a chance to do this again until the end of July, beginning of August.
Oh, well.
But it's an exciting time had by all. And with exciting times had by all, I think it might be time to talk about Devon Nunes and his memo writing skills. Joshua, what's been happening in America?
God, I have no clue whatsoever.
Would you like me to tell you a story?
That would be good. Now, I've just been hearing, I haven't actually investigated it particularly much because I didn't want to hurt my brain. So
It's a very soft and tender brain.
It is. First I heard there was a memo, and some people wanted it released because there was a hashtag, and other people didn't. And then but the people who wanted it released were the people who wrote it or something. And then eventually it came out, and it did say some stuff, but not the stuff that they said that it said. And it seemed like nobody involved in producing it had actually read anything to do with it or even the memo itself, and it all just collapsed inwardly into some sort of farcical black hole of farcicality, which is a word.
Actually, you've summed up the entire issue almost perfectly. That was the podcaster's guide to the conspiracy. We'll see you next week.
Bye. No,
okay. Unfortunately. I mean, that vague, hand-wavy description is actually fairly close to what most people's understanding of what happened last week.
But most people are idiots, ourselves included.
Yes, precisely. I mean, frankly, I pride myself on being one of the most educated idiots out there.
Indeed, I'm surprised we're both wearing pants, to be perfectly honest.
I just haven't washed my legs in a really, really long time. This is black mold.
Ah, lovely.
That's why you should have. That's why I told you not to sniff it when you came in before.
Yeah, but it's so inviting. Oh well.
Anyway, so long story short, Devon Nunes released a memo over the objections of the FBI, the the Department of Justice and the ranking Democrats on the Select Committee on Intelligence, claiming that the evidence used to obtain the Pfizer warrant, this is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant they used to get information on one Carter Page, one of the many Russian-friendly people that Trump knew during the transition and the campaign, etc., etc., claimed that the evidence they used to get that warrant was untoward and that the FBI were acting in a reckless and partisan manner, with the implication being the Department of Justice was either complicit with this reckless or partisan behaviour, or the DOJ had been hoodwinked by the Democrats who were investigating Carter Page when they should have been investigating Hillary Clinton. And basically all centres on Christopher Steele and the Steele dossier.
Now, this wiretap, is this the one that Trump was talking about during the campaign when he claimed that they were wiretapping Trump Towers, or is this a different wiretap?
This is a different wiretap.
Ah, okay. So
it's one of the many
at least it's
wiretaps.
not tangled in with that whole kettle of malarkey.
So basically what happened is that there's a narrative in US politics at the moment that almost the entirety of the investigation, the Mueller investigations of what happened during the election, dates back to Christopher Steele and the dossier he wrote whilst he was a member of Fusion GPS. Now, the Steele dossier was shopped to the intelligence agencies in the US. It turns out that Christopher Steele's company, Fusion GPS, had been employed by the Clinton campaign during the campaign. And so certain Republicans are going, well, look, this is a politically motivated dossier where Christopher Steele was working for the Clintons to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. And thus this is a partisan dossier designed to cast aspersions on our president. Ipso facto, this evidence should be thrown out of court. And the Nunes Memo, I should not use the word Nunes and Memo at the same time.
Some people pronounce it Memo, which is just bizarre, but does have a more musical quality to it.
The Nunes Memo. That sounds like a superhero from the 1960s. My name is Nunes Memo, and I write very long letters to the government. Anyway, so the story basically is Nunes thinks that the Pfizer warrant for Carter Page relied upon dodgy intel, and for that reason the FBI was acting recklessly, and they were acting in a partisan fashion, and some heads should roll.
Right. Now, this was the content of the memo, or was this general sentiment which the memo was addressing?
So the memo is 5 pages in length, and basically it alleges a whole amount of improprieties by the FBI in getting this FISA warrant. Namely, that when the FBI applied for the warrant, they used an unverified source of information, the Christopher Steele dossier. They then used that information to get a FISA warrant from the courts, and then they used that to justify spying on Carter Page, and so Carter Page has effectively been surveilled illegally by the FBI using faulty intelligence that was procured through political means.
Okay, well, first of all, let's assume that it's true for a start. What would that actually mean if only one little bit of this investigation turned out to be wrong, or was this supposed to be emblematic, sort of symbolic of the fact that the entire investigation is partisan and entirely needs to be torn down?
You ask a very good question, because
Thank you.
as occurred almost immediately after the memo was released, and actually was rumoured before the memo was released, Donald Trump thinks this vindicates him entirely. This shows there's no collusion with Russia, and that the FBI are very, very naughty. The only problem is that most of the Republicans on the House Select Committee on Intelligence are going, yeah, we actually don't think this has any effect upon the actual investigation into potential collusion or perverting of justice by the Russians. This is simply an issue we have with the surveillance of Carter Page. Mueller and Rosenberg, the acting Attorney General, should be allowed to continue their investigation. This has no bearing upon that investigation. Nunes himself seems to vacillate between this is terrible and shows the investigation is partisan, to no, the men and women of the FBI are trustworthy individuals, and that we can have implicit trust in the institution itself, despite the fact that I'm claiming that members of that institution acting in a reckless and partisan manner. So Nunes himself, is it Nunes or Nunes?
I don't know.
And I actually
don't
just don't
care enough to find out.
I actually don't care either. It's just a name, man. It's just a name.
Let's just call him Devon.
Devon.
Our
Devo.
mate
Good old
Dev.
Devo. Yeah, Dev. The Devster.
The Devster. I like it.
So he's both trying to claim that there are bad apples in the FBI, which can make us doubt what the FBI produce, whilst also claiming there's no reason for us to doubt the FBI in this matter, which does make me think that our friend of the show, Lee Basham, must be kind of rolling in his grave. He's not dead, but I'm assuming he's built a grave so he can roll in it, given the incomprehensible statements that the Devster has made about the FBI by going, they are bad, and we can trust them, but they are bad. That does seem ever so slightly inconsistent.
Yes. Now, I had heard it suggested that that the Devonator had not actually read the particulars of the Pfizer warrant that he claimed was completely falsy.
Certainly his reasoning indicates he hasn't read the details of the Pfizer warrant, or if he has, he doesn't understand how Pfizer warrants work. And so there's a bunch of issues here which do suggest something untoward by the Republicans on this particular committee, who are the ones who pushed for this memo to be released. In that, on one hand, and she's going to be lots of hands, basically I'm going to have lots of hands by the time this finishes, Nunes claims, the Devster, the Devonator, Devmaster Jr., he claims that to get the Pfizer warrant, the FBI cited the Steele dossier and then cited a Yahoo article claiming the Steele dossier had been vindicated. But the Yahoo News article itself relied on the Steele dossier in the first place. And look, they're just using circular reasoning to get their justification out. Except that if you actually read the application, or actually the FISA warrant itself, what happened was that after the warrant was granted, the Department of Justice said, look, this Yahoo article indicates that knowledge of the Steele dossier is out there, and this is reason to suspect that if the contents of the dossier are true, that Carter Page is probably going to be destroying evidence. And so the DOJ used the article as evidence as to why the warrant should be granted, on the ground that if the contents were true, Page would be doing his best to remove that evidence from the record. So that wasn't part of the FBI's application. That was part of the DOJ's reasoning as to why the warrant should be granted in the first place. So that's one particular issue. Another issue which comes to mind here is that the Devster wants to claim the Steele dossier was a necessary condition for the granting of the Pfizer warrant. And it is true, in the reports, it is claimed that without the Steele dossier, or at least the bits of the Steele dossier that were mentioned, only select parts of the dossier are actually in the Pfizer warrant application itself. Those bits were necessary for the granting of the warrant in the same respect that every bit of evidence in the application was taken to be necessary for the granting of the warrant. So Devster goes, well, without the Steele dossier, this warrant would be worthless. But actually, without any of the individual bits of evidence taken together, the warrant wasn't going to be granted. When they say it's a necessary part, they're saying everything taken together necessitates the granting of this particular surveillance. But possibly more embarrassing, Carter Page has been under surveillance by the FBI since at least 2013.
Right.
Because Carter Page has, for a very long period of time, talked about his links to the Russian government. and the FBI have been concerned that he's an agent in service of a foreign power. And so they have been surveilling him on multiple occasions, having got FISA warrants before the Steele dossier was even a mote in somebody's eyes.
Right, well that does put a different spin on things. It does strike me, though, that all this does look a little bit strange and dodgy. Not overly conspiratorial yet.
Well, it's conspiratorial for the sheer fact that the Devster is trying to make the claim the FBI acting in a politically motivated manner and pulling the wool over the eyes of the DOJ. So they're covering up the inadequacies of their investigation by using bad tricks, basically, to get their warrants and the like. So in that respect, there is a suggestion of a conspiracy within the FBI to pervert the course of justice and operate in a political manner.
Does he go so far as to say things like Ron Johnson, who we talked about in the news section, says that there is actually the secret subgroup within the FBI that's dedicated specifically to bringing down Trump, or more widely to going against Republican presidents in general? Or is he just sort of saying in this case they've got their own, they're putting an undue spin on it?
He wants it both ways. He both wants to claim that the FBI activating in a politically partisan manner, and at the same time also say, well, it's just a few cases of people cutting corners, but really that's not good enough. Because remember, the Devster claims that the FBI can be trusted implicitly despite the content of the memo he has released. We should trust the FBI in all that they do, apart from the things the Devster doesn't like them doing. In that case, we can doubt them. But otherwise, complete and utter trust in what they're doing.
And actually, one thing we haven't mentioned yet is the circumstances surrounding its release, because there was all this release the memo talk. So who wanted it released, who didn't want it released, and why?
People who didn't want it released were the FBI.
Also, sorry, I forgot to say, you said that the Devster wants to have it both ways, and you didn't give me time to say just like your mum. So I thought I'd just take the opportunity to put that in there now.
Yeah, it's far too late. You need to find a way to cleave through the verbiage.
I was kind of expecting you to just wants it both ways, just like your mum. But
just like your mum.
Just like your mum.
Just like your mum.
Just like everyone's mum.
Yep. Everybody's mum wants it both ways. You heard it here, folks.
I've completely forgotten what we were talking about.
Don't worry. I've also forgotten, but I can reconstruct it using
we were talking about the release and who wanted it released.
So the DOJ and the FBI thought the release of this memo was disastrous because it was a grave risk to their operations. That isn't something I'm too concerned about. I think in many respects, many people, especially in those positions of power, use claims of we have to keep our processes secret, otherwise the enemy will find out what we're doing. That's kind of overused in political talk. The Democratic members of the Select Committee also didn't want it released, and they've written a reply memo which apparently deals with all of the evidential and procedural errors in the Devster's original memo. His memo is 5 pages, their memo's apparently 10. And they've gone through and explained why he doesn't understand how FISA warrants are applied for. He doesn't address the fact that to get a FISA warrant, you have to go through a thing called the Woods procedure, where the Department of Justice has to corroborate or verify all of the individual bits of evidence that have been put forward for the FISA warrant in the first place. So it's not sufficient for the FBI to go, here's some evidence, give us a warrant. DOJ has to go, hold on 1 second here, Milano. Let me just, you got some evidence for this? And what about this thing here? Or what about that thing? And apparently these things are done with a fine-tooth comb and issues of that particular type. So the Democrats and their memo, which is a memo by this guy called Adam Schiff, they claim that actually this is just a storm in a teacup. Devster doesn't understand what's going on here, which seems to be the view of most legal experts in the US as well. And so for that reason, basically this appears to be a partisan attack by Republicans to cast scorn on at least elements of the Mueller investigation.
And one other thing, I don't know if it comes up so much in this, but it was something mentioned in the article about Ron Johnson that we were working off of in the news section. At the end of it, they pointed out that all this talk of a secret faction within the FBI who wants to nobble Donald Trump, there really does seem to have been a faction with the FBI who were out to nobble Hillary Clinton, going by the timing of James Comey's infamous statement that was taken to be sort of the death blow to her campaign.
Yes, there was talk about the New York office of the FBI basically having gone rogue and quite deliberately hating on Hillary Clinton and leaking out information about the email service staff because they were kind of in cahoots with Rudy Giuliani, was the operating thesis at the time. Now, admittedly, on the other side, it was quite interesting that as talk of the memo started resonating in Washington, lots of international newspapers started running stories on, you know what happened before the Christopher Steele dossier? The Dutch were informing the CIA and the FBI about Russia trying to cause issue with the election. Almost as if other people were going, we need to leak some stories out here which indicate that the Steele dossier isn't as big a deal in the story about the Russia collusion investigation because there were earlier bigger bits of evidence that the FBI were relying upon anyway. So there does seem to be an indication here that maybe some elements in the FBI, maybe the DOJ, had gone, we need to leak some information just to pour water on this electrical fire. Because pouring water on an electrical fire is always a good idea.
It is. That's what I do every day.
Yeah.
I start an electrical fire and then I pour water on it and then I laugh.
Yes, and also get electrocuted, but that's another matter entirely. Now, I think what's interesting here is that depending on what media you're reading or watching, and by media I say depending on whether you're paying attention to Fox or some other news network in the US, either there's a conspiracy by the Republicans to basically create a misinformational smokescreen about the investigation by using the Nunes memo as a way of distracting, or at least casting aspersions on Robert Mueller's special counsel. Or this is a claim that there is in fact a conspiracy within the FBI where they're trying to undermine the president. Now, I don't think it's entirely beyond reason to believe that there could be a conspiracy by the FBI to cut corners and to force the investigation in a particular direction. But if that conspiracy is occurring, there's a whole bunch of issues that have to be accounted for, such as the serialization of all evidence that goes through the FBI. So it's difficult but not impossible to introduce manufactured evidence into the evidentiary chain. You just have to make sure the serialization is correct and make sure that you don't have any duplicates appearing within your system. You need to make sure that you've paid off particular members of the DOJ and the like. It's not beyond reason to think that maybe elements within the security apparatus would have set out to do this. But it seems more plausible to think that either the Devster really doesn't understand his job as chair on the select committee, or is aware that by putting out what are, in the end, rather ambiguously and badly written memos, at least causes a certain amount of consternation and confusion, which then allows you to get some political hits upon your potential enemies in Congress and the Senate. And that seems like an easier task than it would be for the FBI to engage in a large-scale conspiracy to get a warrant against Carter Page, a known political operator with ties to the Kremlin, who has openly spoken about in the past his ties to the Putin regime. So it's not as if they're creating evidence of corruption or potential political treason that we didn't already know about. It's not as if they're setting Page up to be a villain when he isn't. Page was already a villain. It's just a matter of whether he's a villain in this particular collusion story.
Right, well that sounds like That sounds like a conclusion to me, actually. Are there any further sort of lessons about conspiracy theories? Any more of a moral we can take out of this, or does that sum it all up, do you think?
Just your mum.
Mm.
Just your mum.
Just my mum. Well then, I suppose, do we have any last minute topics apart from the usual administration?
No, I think basically that's kind of the end.
We
had an exciting adventure with an autocue, which has probably caused us a certain amount of confoundment and bewilderment, but that'll be perfected by next week.
Probably. Almost certainly. Maybe. Who knows?
Well, we'll find out.
So in that case, until then, you will be and are currently listening now to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. My name is Josh Edison. You can get in touch with me on Twitter with the username MonkeyFluids if that's your thing. Over to you.
You can find me on the internet with the handle Conspiracism, where I tweet and retweet things about conspiracy theories, or you can visit my website, episto.org, which is mostly a list of podcasts, but occasionally also makes reference to papers which are forthcoming or in print by me about conspiracy theories.
Now, if you'd like to find this podcast in audio format, for you Apple-ophiles can find it on iTunes. Android perverts can get it on Stitcher. The rest of you can find it probably in those places as well, I guess. I don't judge. A few other things, but it's out there and can be listened to. It can also be watched, though. That's the thing. That's the whole reason why we have the whole teleprompter setup thingy, so we can actually sort of steer more or less at a lens instead of having to constantly gaze at something in our hands.
And if you give us feedback as to how well that worked or didn't work, please do. We always enjoy a bit of feedback.
We do. You can give us that feedback by commenting on iTunes at least, and probably on Stitcher. I don't know what they do, but I assume it must be the same. You can also go to the site where this podcast is hosted, which is podbean.com. If you go to conspiracism.podbean.com, you'll find all the episodes of this podcast, and you'll be able to leave comments wherever you want, like Madness. You'll also find
the
links.
band?
Yes, exactly, like Madness the Band. They're one of our key commenters, I assume. Never having read any of the comments left.
Well, never read the comments, Josh. Never read the comments.
I just assumed that Madness are there commenting on them.
Yeah. Our house in the middle of our street.
Welcome to the House of Fun. The other one, it must be love. Love, love. Dun dun.
And that basically was the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. We'll see you next week, where our special topic will be Redacted. Can't wait to talk about Redacted with you.
It'll be a redacted good time.
Redacted.
Goodbye.
Redacted.
You've been listening to Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, hosted by Josh Edison and M. Dentith. If you'd like to help support us, please find details of our pledge drive at either Patreon or Podbean. If you'd like to get in contact with us, email us at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com.